Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Racha Kodash. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. And today we're going to go into the book of Galatians, the second chapter. Then 14 years after, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took Titus with me also. And as I think he mentions in here, right, about Titus being a Greek, the third verse, which once again, he was an Israelite, that he wasn't born in the customs of Israel. So he grew up, after the customs of the Greeks. And so there are certain things that he didn't do, right, or didn't practice. But by blood, he was an Israelite, okay, who had now become a believer by the hands of Paul. So he says here, right, 14 years after, he goes up to Jerusalem with Titus and Barnabas. And I went up by revelation. Okay, so the Spirit led him, right? The Spirit basically told him, look, go, you go up there. And now remember, when you go back to the book of Acts, right, before Acts 15, when you go back, Paul, you had prophets, right, Agabus being one of them, that came to Antioch and prophesied about a dearth, okay, that should happen. Let me see if I can find that. This is Acts 15. Let's see if it's before that. That should happen before that would, a famine that would happen. And so Paul ended up going to Jerusalem with Barnabas to let me see if it's in here, to send aid, right, and relief. Yeah, let's check. I don't think it's 15, but okay, it might be in one of the earlier chapters. Whoa. Calm down. All right, let's just look up Agabus. I don't know why I didn't do that before. There you go. That's what it is. Acts 11. Okay. And when was this? This was... Yes. All right. Well, yeah, I'm wondering. I forgot exactly when this point was that Agabus prophesied this, but long story short, there were multiple times when Paul had to go to Jerusalem, but he wasn't there as frequently as he was in Antioch, right? And he mentions that how pretty much the Lord had it to where the apostleship of the circumcision was basically placed upon Peter, while the apostleship of the uncircumcision was placed upon Paul. So there wouldn't be a need for Paul to be based in Jerusalem with Peter there, at the same time. Meanwhile, they have, somewhat different audience, right, to which they're all Israelites anyway, but to preach the gospel too. So in any case, continuing here in Galatians 2, so the Lord through the Spirit directed Paul to go up to Jerusalem. And as he says, he went there and communicated unto them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, being these Israelites that had now come to the realization, right, of being Israelites and the belief in Yahweh Shai. But as he says here, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. Because Paul wanted to make sure that the things that the gospel he was preaching to them was in line, right, with the things that were being taught at Jerusalem. Okay, so he privately, as he says, and we'll read this in the NLT as well, but he basically, those that were of reputation, right, that were established in the church, he basically just confirmed with them, as he says, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain, meaning the things that he would have taught would have been wasted effort if it wasn't in line with what they were teaching. So it says in NLT, I went there because God revealed to me that I should go. While I was there, I met privately with those considered to be leaders of the church and shared with them the message I had been preaching to the Gentiles. I wanted to make sure that we were in agreement for fear that all my efforts had been wasted and I was running the race for nothing. But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek. Now, keep this in mind. Paul is his message here is to the churches in Galatia. And he's given them this context here, saying, look, even when I went to Jerusalem to speak to those that were elders or leaders in the church concerning the things that I was teaching you guys, as you were known as Gentiles, even when I went there and spoke with them to confirm, to make sure we were in agreement, and I had Titus with me, Titus, who was, as it says, being a Greek, so he was raised not in the non-Israelite customs, was who was with me was compelled, but neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. So he's saying, these people are whoever it is that's coming to you and teaching you and pushing this circumcision and the law of Moses. Guess what? When I went to Jerusalem and spoke to the elders and leaders in the church, and I had Titus with me, who was a Greek, and he wasn't circumcised, they didn't say he had to be circumcised. And that because of false brethren, unawares brought in. So when you actually go into that unawares, these are men that feigned themselves, right, to be brethren or believers, but found out to be false, secretly, right, or surreptitiously brought in. And the word surreptitious means like sneakily, in a way that attempts to avoid notice or attention, secretively. So, as it says here, they were brought in to be among us, who came in privately to spy out our liberty, which we have in Yahushua HaMashiach, that they might bring us into bondage. Okay, and I'll read this in the NLT as well. It says here, even that, and basically they wanted to bring and push that being under the law, that's the bondage, right? To be bound back to the law. Okay, and that's the only way, that's the way you have to go, but that's not the case. That's why he called them false brethren, because then they didn't actually believe in salvation through Yahushua. Even that question came up only because of some so-called Christians, they're false ones really, who were secretly brought in. They sneaked in to spy on us and take away the freedom we have in Yahushua HaMashiach. They wanted to enslave us and force us to follow their Jewish regulations, to whom we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour. This is Old English, but Paul speaks in a polished Old English. So he's not saying here that they gave place to them. He's saying here they did not. Okay, that's why he says no, not for an hour. I mean, we didn't even entertain that stuff at all. And the NLT says, but we refuse to give in to them for a single moment. We wanted to preserve the truth of the gospel message for you. So he's saying there were certain men that came in among us. They heard the things that we were teaching, and they try to push that narrative of rather than being free through Yahushai being limited through the regulations of the Jewish traditions and laws. And he's saying we didn't give heed to that at all, so that we could preserve the gospel, okay, of this of salvation through faith. But of these who seemed to be somewhat, whatsoever they were, it maketh no matter to me. God accepteth no man's person. For they who seemed to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. And Paul, remember, he mentioned above that he was speaking to the leaders in the church, right? So basically these men that were like, big men, so to speak, right, held in high regard. And as he's saying, whatever they were, whatever position they had, it doesn't really matter to me, because the Most High does not accept persons. He's not when it comes to his work, it's not about playing favorites. So it doesn't matter how people revere you or reverence you as a man in this faith. For they who seem to be somewhat, right? So he's saying even those that were considered like top men or leaders in conference, right? In let's actually go into that word conference, because he's saying here that he spoke to them, but they didn't have anything to add on to what he said, meaning they were in agreement with it, right? To lay upon in addition to, right? To lay upon oneself in addition, to communicate, to impart. So he's saying when I spoke with them, even these top renowned men, they didn't even have anything to add to what it is that I told them I was teaching. But contrawise, but rather instead, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter. So when they saw that the Lord had ordained Paul to handle and preach and like spearhead the teaching of the gospel to the Israelites that were not raised and born in the customs, they were likened onto the uncircumcision, because a good majority of them, if not all, were actually uncircumcised. Circumcision was a custom of Israel, right? But if you weren't born in Israel, like you weren't born into that, and you were born into, amongst heathen and raised up in those Greek customs, you wouldn't be circumcised. So when they realized that the Lord had put that mission upon Paul, right, just as he had committed the preaching of the gospel to the circumcision, the Israelites that knew they were Israelites, onto Peter, for he that wrought effectually in Peter to the apostleship. So the same God that was working through Peter as the apostle of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me toward the Gentiles, toward the Israelites that didn't know they were Israelites. So you had these two types of Israelites here, but a common goal. You had Israelites that knew they were Israelites. They were of the circumcision, but that wasn't enough. The gospel still had to be preached to them so that they could believe in Yahushua. That's the end goal. But then you also had other Israelites that didn't know they were Israelites, that were raised up in other customs, that still needed to be taught the gospel, because the end goal was for them to also believe in Yahushua. And in the process for the Gentiles, right, the Israelites that didn't know they were Israelites, the process for them that the circumcision didn't have to worry about is that these didn't know. So there were things they were doing that would be contrary to the law. And there were certain things that they had to, come to terms with and understand and pick up, both in their journey in the faith of Yahushua. Things that those of the circumcision were already accustomed to doing. And that's why in the Jerusalem Council, they emphasized, look, these believe in Yahushua just like you do. And justification comes through believing in Yahushua. All right. Everything else is secondary to that. So if they believe in Yahushua, that's the first and most important part. The rest about the laws that they that they have to keep and this, don't try to burden them with everything that you do, because they're not accustomed to that. They weren't raised like that. And you're going to put too much upon them as to where the primary focus should be on the faith in Yahushua, and they'll pick up the rest as time goes on. That's why in the council, the apostles selected, the main core things and said, look, These are non-negotiables, right? You do these, you stay away from that. The rest you sort of pick up as you go, but focus mainly on the faith in Yahweh Shai. And when James, Cephas, and John, Cephas being Peter, and these were the heads of the church, who seemed to be pillars, see, heads, perceived the grace that was given unto me, they gave me, or they gave to me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship. And the right hands of fellowship, it's is really just like saying they co-signed or they signed off on or authorized, which, you know, maybe that might be a bad use of words, but we'll just say they signed off on the work that Paul and Barnabas were doing, that we should go onto the heathen and they onto the circumcision. So they were like, okay, look, it makes sense that this is how the Most High is setting it up. So, you know, you go, you know, to the Asia Minor and those areas, and you teach them, and we'll stay within these areas where you had Israelites that knew they were Israelites, and we'll teach them here. Only they would that we should remember the poor, the same which I also was forward to do, right? Which is, don't neglect the poor, right? NLT, their only suggestion was that we keep on helping the poor, which I have always been eager to do. Now, remember, the Apostle Paul, he's his message to the Galatians, the churches in Galatia is, look, number one, what I taught you is true, it's authentic, right? I was ordained by the Most High. Like, for example, when I went here and I spoke to them, this is what they said. When I took Titus with me and he wasn't circumcised, they didn't say he had to be circumcised, right? Even the apostles in Jerusalem already, you know, signed off on the work that I'm doing with Barnabas. So what I'm telling you, I am an authority, right, for you to listen to me and not to be swayed by men coming to you and teaching something else. But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. For before that certain came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles. So Peter came to Antioch. Paul's given an account, right? Peter came to Antioch, and at some point later, men that came from James, were sent by James, also came to Antioch. But before those people got there, right, Peter, as it says, he did eat with the Gentiles. These were Israelites that, once again, weren't raised in the customs of Israel, right? So they were, some were uncircumcised, right? Some of the foods they ate might not have been like what we ate, but they let them know, look, if it has some abominable things in there, you can't eat that. But Peter was okay, breaking bread with them, right? And that's something that was actually frowned upon prior to this whole situation. That's why they try to, rip him a new one when he went into the household of Cornelius and broke bread with them. And then he had to explain it to them. So it says here, but when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. See, and this Paul looked at like, hold on, what? Like you were just eating with them and everything was all good. But when you heard that the men were from James were coming, right, from those that were of the circumcision, you basically, like, as it says, he withdrew. So he separated himself from the Gentiles, right, the Israelites that weren't born and raised in the customs, because he feared being criticized, right, by the circumcision. And the other Jews dissembled likewise with him. Now the word dissembled here, it's basically like to act in a hypocritical manner. So it says here, to dissemble, to act hypocritically with. So Paul is saying here, Peter was being a hypocrite, and those that were there, the other Jews, also joined right after him. In so much that Barnabas also was carried away with their dissimulation. Once again, their hypocrisy. And that's what that word, look at the hypokrisis, right? Answering the act of a stage player, dissimulation, hypocrisy. Now, let's look up here the word hypocrisy. Oh, So it says hypocrisy, the practice of claiming to have moral standards or beliefs to which one's own behavior does not conform, right? So why did Paul say that Peter was being a hypocrite here? Because Peter claimed to believe in this gospel, right? In the gospel of Yahushua. The gospel of Yahushua says that there's no difference between the Jew or the Gentile. And Peter himself in past times did break bread with Cornelius and the rest of them. So really, according to the truth of the gospel, it shouldn't be a problem and you shouldn't be criticized if you're breaking bread with the quote unquote Gentiles, if these are believers and through their faith, they're justified. But if that's what he believed, why were his actions contrary in withdrawing himself from them because he feared he would be criticized? Because why not stand by what you push or believe? But when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, see, I said unto Peter before them all, if thou, being a Jew, livest after the manner of the Gentiles. So you being a Jew, born and raised in the customs, right? You are able to break bread with them and hang out with them, right? And basically be buddy with them, and not as the Jews, because the Jews frowned upon that. But this was through Yahushua, through the gospel of Yahushua, which was like the glue. It was okay because they were justified through faith and not through the law. So no longer was it like, oh, this is an uncircumcised person, you can't be around them. But this is an Israelite who believes in Yahushua, and you may be an Israelite who also believes in Yahushua, but you're circumcised and you were raised in the customs. But that's okay because we're one in Yahushua. But he's saying here, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as the Jews? So if you, being a Jew, are not living as the Jews do, because you're here hanging out with Gentiles, quote unquote Gentiles, why are you then compelling them to live as you? Why are you, basically still of the energy or mindset of they gotta keep the laws, or they gotta do this, or they gotta basically heap onto them if they're gonna come into the faith, they gotta live as we do. But you are not living as you do. It says, we who are Jews by nature, meaning you were born in it, and not sinners of the Gentiles, right? So you weren't born into, let's say, the heathenistic customs, right? And basically born into sin, right? Which is the things that you just knew and you grew up with. But you were born knowing you're an Israelite, right? Being raised and knowing, okay, keep the Passover, don't do this, don't do that, and so on. Knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Yahushua HaMashiach. Even we have believed in Yahushua HaMashiach, and that justified goes into like, basically your righteousness is not of the law. The only way you would get that is if you could keep all the laws 100%, and you can't. So you cannot be justified by the law, but by faith in Yahushua. Even if you have faith in Yahushua, even if you don't keep the laws perfectly, you are justified. So as he says here, even we have believed in Yahushua HaMashiach, that we might be justified by the faith of Yahushua, not by how well we keep the laws, right? And not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified, because you're only righteous if you keep them all. And if you break one, you're in fraction of break them all. You're not, it's a all or nothing, right? With the law. So nobody can be justified by it because nobody can keep it perfectly. At least as Paul is saying, not amongst us. Our way is through Yahushua. But if while we seek to be justified by Hamashiach through the faith we have in him, we ourselves also are found sinners, is therefore Hamashiach the minister of sin? God forbid. Let's read this in the NLT. But long story short, he's saying, look, actually, let me just read it. It says, but suppose we seek to be made right with God through faith in Yahushua, and then we are found guilty because we have abandoned the law. What he means by that is, through faith in Yahushua, we are no longer trying to keep the laws 100% and trying to kill yourself over it, but rather we're prioritizing our faith in Yahushua first. If in doing so, we are found guilty of abandoning the law, would that mean Yahushua has led us into sin? Because through believing in Yahushua, we're no longer striving for perfection of keeping the law? Absolutely not. For if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. And what he is saying here is the thing that was destroyed was the belief that you got to keep the laws perfectly, right? It's all about the laws, the laws, the laws. That was destroyed through the faith in Yahushua, understanding that that wasn't the way that you would be justified. But if you try to build that back again, and you're trying to now be through the Gentiles being Israelites, right, that are believing, you're trying to push that same thing that you broke down through your belief in Yahushua, you're making yourself a transgressor because now you're trying to push a means by which you will not be justified. NLT, it says, rather, I am a sinner if I rebuild the old system of law I already tore down, because that system didn't justify you. By the standards of that system, you would be a transgressor. For I, through the law, am dead to the law, that I might live unto God. It says here, for when I tried to keep the law, it condemned me, so I died to the law. I stopped trying to meet all its requirements so that I might live for God. I am crucified with Yahushua, nevertheless I live, not I, or not yet I, but Hamashiach liveth in me. That's basically the new man, right? Being renewed. So the old man was crucified, was on the cross with Yahushua, but now we are renewed, as he's saying, but you're not, as he says, not I, but Hamashiach liveth in me. So this new life, this renewed man is not after, I'm not living after me or living to do my will, but I'm living through the spirit of Yahushua. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God. So this life that I live now, having been quote unquote reborn, is a life dedicated to serve the Lord, is a life that is through the faith of Yahushua, right? So the things that the faith of Yahushua requires me to do, that's what I will do. Who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not frustrate the grace of God, for if righteousness came by the law, then Hamashiach is dead in vain. Because the grace of God is the goodwill that gave us an avenue to say, you don't have to keep the laws to be justified, right? The laws are not going to justify you. Let me say it that way. But don't just go and say, I'm just going to go and be a sinner. You do the best you can, but in your mind, keep in mind that what's priority is the faith in Yahushua. So don't frustrate that grace by now trying to go and keep something perfectly that the Lord has said you don't have to do perfectly, because I've given you grace. Because if righteousness came by the law, then Yahushua is dead in vain. What would be the need of Yahushua dying if you could be made righteous through the law? Yahushua was the second chance. He was the goodwill of the Lord to say, you cannot be righteous by the law, but in order to gain salvation, you gotta have some avenue, some ladder, some connector, and that's Yahushua. And that brings us to the end of the book of Galatians, the second chapter. Lord willing, that was edifying to the elect. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahushai, Bahasham, Rachak Kodash. And until next time, Shalom.